is Vesela Daskalova. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the INET Institute at the University of Cambridge. And we have Paul Ormerod visiting us this week. We're very happy to have him here and that he has agreed to give this short interview. Paul Ormerod has written a number of best-selling books, including The Death of Economics, Butterfly Economics, and Why Things Fail, as well as numerous articles. And in short, he's one of the most prominent advocates of new economic thinking in the UK. So, Paul, we're just interested in learning more about your work and your views. And my first question relates to your view of economics as an academic discipline. You have very much criticized mainstream economics, meaning the standard tools and methods that academic economists use and that are used by policymakers. Can you tell us why, and can you tell us how you would like to see economics change and develop?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think first of all, I could just make a positive point about economics. I mean, economics has one really powerful insight that agents react to incentives. And this is a very powerful one, which certainly people from a natural science background or even people from other social sciences don't realise its importance. Now, I want to come back to that, but I think I want to make 2 points in terms of what I would see my main criticisms of mainstream economics. I mean, the first of which is it focuses very, almost exclusively, not completely, on equilibrium. And so in doing so, it misses out time and it misses out process. And in the real world in which we live, these are very important. And most of the time, systems will be out of equilibrium. And so we need to sort of like reintroduce time and bring that back into economics and recognise that equilibrium may be a useful concept, it may not be, but we have to describe out of equilibrium behaviour, which I think is important. But coming back to the first point about the role of incentives, I say that's a very powerful positive point for economics. But then economists go on and say people react to incentives in a particular way, what's become known as rational choice theory. Now, like any theory, any scientific theory, it makes assumptions. And whether this is reasonable depends upon how these approximate to the real world. And I think there are 2 particular assumptions which are increasingly not good descriptions of how the world behaves. First of all, that agents act independently. They choose autonomously. And secondly, that agents have stable preferences. They have a well-articulated stable preference set. Now, in some circumstances, this might be perfectly reasonable. Say in well-developed consumer markets where the products have been around for a long time, people can develop preferences, they can get information, and they may not be influenced directly by others. But increasingly, in the 21st century, I think these assumptions are not true. People's tastes and preferences are increasingly altered directly by other people's behaviour. People do not select independently, and their tastes evolve over time. In some markets, we may say in new technology markets, they learn their taste, they have no preferences, and they have to learn these during the process of consumption. So it's these 2 assumptions, and we need fundamentally new models of agent behaviour which are much more evolutionary based with interacting agents on networks. I think is a way forward. We need to actually have a different model, a different base model for economic theory in terms of how agents make choices.
So Paul, I would just like to ask about your new book, which is about networks. In it you argue, as you just said, that networks are very important and that we operate in a largely interconnected world where people influence each other. And you argue also that policymakers somehow fail to take this into account sufficiently. How would you suggest that policymakers change their approach in order to be able to account for this network effect?
Well, I can give one example where this is already happening, and in the models which we used in central banks prior to the financial crisis, if you like, financial contagion, wasn't in these models. And in the mainstream macro models as they then stood, the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, there was only one agent. And so by definition, there couldn't be a cascade of bank failures, for example, spreading across a network. But say the Bank of England, the American authorities, the European Central Bank, now are building models in which there can be contagion. So if a bank fails, it may have direct consequences for other people. So that's one way where they are beginning to look at these things. I think it means that we have to have really quite different ways of thinking about policy, thinking about macro policy, for example. Most of the work on macroeconomics, for whatever aspect of the subject we're looking at, seems to think that there is a one-to-one correspondence between an act of policy, changing interest rate, increasing public expenditure, whatever, and the consequences. Well, one thing is that if people are connected, how this information is received, how a narrative is constructed about this policy, how it spreads across relevant networks, what the dominant narrative becomes, can be very important. So let's think, for example, about the debates about austerity policies, both here in the UK and elsewhere in the European Union. Now, a key thing seems to me that if an increase in public expenditure is being proposed, what is going to happen to the long-term bond rate of that particular government? And we've seen different ways in which this can react. So when the Conservative government came to power in Britain, for example, in 2010, they managed to convince the markets that in some way Britain's public finances were sound. And so Britain's interest rates have remained at 2 or 3%. Whereas we've seen, say, in the Mediterranean countries, where many of the objective economic criteria, such as public debt relative to GDP, are well, certainly in the case of Spain, no worse than in the UK. They've been received in a completely different way. How is that narrative built up? And how does that spread across the network? We have to understand this intermediate level between agents' decisions and the macro consequences. And if you like, the networks mediate that. It's that in creating a narrative at the macro level. Or thinking about, say, microeconomic policies, say social policies. Think about issues of alcoholism and binge drinking amongst young people, obesity. Then, of course, incentives have a role. I mean, that's important. And the instinct of governments is to tax or withdraw subsidies or whatever, and these do have an impact. But this is much more about social values, about what's acceptable. Certainly think of the stupendous amounts of alcohol that many young people in Britain consume. They've always done this, but not on this scale, and it's now become socially acceptable. And this is because it's spread across the relevant network, and this is now an acceptable way to behave. And governments need to focus much more on how they can influence these networks, how they can influence the spread of ideas and influence, rather than just rely upon the traditional tools, which will take us so far, but won't provide, as we've seen, by any means the complete answer.
I guess there are several different aspects of what you say. So on the one hand, there's the government taking into account the effect of networks when it comes to financial regulation, for example. So I can clearly see that basically taking into account which bank is linked to which other bank through their balance sheets. This seems to be easily traceable for the government, and I guess there would be no disagreement in society that it's a desirable goal to keep track of these things. On the other hand, what you say about government intervention to maybe correct or address other social phenomena like binge drinking, I wonder where do you see how do you see the government exactly taking into account the network effects there? Isn't it a bit too interfering in people's lives to keep track of network effects in such contexts? And my last question with respect to that is, what do you think the government role should be in terms of trying to actively change people's values? Where would be the limits to that?
Well, I mean, there are many. These are very difficult. They're all very difficult questions. I mean, I think. Well, one thing first of all is to say, how we actually influence networks is poorly understood. But the most important point is to recognise that these effects are empirically very important. So we have to have a proper scientific understanding first of all, before we can actually even begin to think about how we go about influencing these things. Although, I mean, some work is being done in this area. It's not necessarily the case that you need to have, I know people feel, well, okay, if it's a network, my behaviour will be monitored constantly. You don't have to have complete information. I mean, a lot of the work that I've been interested in doing is using network-based models of influence and evolving tastes with simple things like survey evidence to actually build models which actually give good approximations of social phenomena like obesity or binge drinking or this sort of thing. And then we get some idea of an approximation of what sort of network structure it is, because as you'll know, not many economists follow the details of different graph theoretic structures, but there's some quite different implications depending on what type of network we've got. So, for example, if we have a network with a few highly connected individuals who have status and standing, well, there's a lot of work on this, but a simple strategy would be to target them. But many real-life social networks don't have such people, and they're much more overlapping friends of friends. And again, in principle, the last 10 years or so have seen a great increase in theoretical understanding how to target these networks. So it doesn't necessarily mean that people are being tracked all the time. It's just a new dimension of policy. I mean, governments do try and change people's behaviour already. They think they can alter price increases by changing an interest rate, which seems an absurd proposition to me, but they think they can do that. They tax things that they think are undesirable, like fuel tax. If you want to deter car emissions, you raise a fuel tax, and there's a big argument about that in most Western countries. So governments already do these sorts of things. I would rather hope, actually, somewhat paradoxically, if we get a better understanding of how to exactly influence these kinds of networks, we will need less government, not more. More can be less if we can actually do it more effectively by targeted interventions that would paradoxically reduce the size of government whilst increasing its effectiveness. Okay.
So coming back to this idea of what the government should do and should not do, what do you think about the government's recent initiative to measure well-being and to potentially introduce the addressing of well-being as one of the goals to pursue instead of GDP growth?
Well, you've mentioned, and I have been very critical of mainstream economics, but I've been a defender of economists in this, because people misunderstand, for example, what GDP what its role is, the measurement of GDP. I mean, GDP was brought in as a measure in the 40s because the most pressing policy problem had been the tremendous collapses of output in the Great Depression of the 1930s. So it was actually imperative that governments could get some handle on this and understand what was going on with output. So it wasn't that economists were ignorant and didn't take account or didn't know about these wider things. If you look, say, at the work of Simon Kuznets, who got the Nobel Prize, who constructed the national accounts in the first place, he makes it very clear. He knows perfectly well he's leaving all these things out because that wasn't his task. So at one level, it's a reasonable thing to do. I think my problem is a different one. If we look at some of the great names in social science, they've all emphasized what we might call the illusion of knowledge, the illusion of control, which applies not just to individual agents, but to all agents, to firms, to central banks, to finance ministries. Obviously, the work of Hayek is prominent in this, the pretense of knowledge. But also, if you actually read Keynes's work, if you read the general theory and the articles he wrote after that, he's very, very clear about the uncertainty, the veil of uncertainty under which agents take decisions, and says things very explicitly like, we have as a rule only the vaguest idea of anything but the most direct consequences of our acts. So Keynes, which can be traced back to his treatise on probability in 1921, is a believer in if you like, fundamental uncertainty, inherent uncertainty. Or Herbert Simon's work, his absolutely outstanding article in 1955 on behavioural economics, which is widely misunderstood within economics, the concept of satisficing. In Simon's, it wasn't just that people, have a set of preferences and stop looking when to find one that approximates it. He said, no, it is not possible in most circumstances to actually take optimal decisions. It doesn't make sense because of the limits on information processing. So here we have, three absolutely, giants in social science, emphasising the limits and the illusion of control. And I think many Western governments have these illusions. They believe they can do huge amounts of stuff by operating on a large scale. And well-being is another example. We ask, have we succeeded in controlling the macroeconomy? Keynes wrote in the 1930s. The first econometric models were built by Larry Klein in the late 40s. So we've had a long time of building models about the macroeconomy, and yet we still can't control it, despite an immense research effort and a huge rise in the size of government. So that, I'm not saying it's not desirable. So of course it's desirable to try, but it's not been successful. And yet here's government wanting to, do something else. People urging governments to try and control other aspects of life. But interestingly, I think there are parallels between GDP growth series and the well-being measures, in that as an approximation, they are both purely random series. There's a very small, very little deviation from randomness in terms of their changes. So if people want to try and control a random series, I would say, jolly good luck to them, because they're not going to be able to do it.
I guess there's something different between the two measures though. So when we talk about GDP growth can be measured. There's an objective unit in which GDP can be measured. Whereas well-being, the well-being measurement is based on self-reporting. So I guess one could make the point that it's actually very difficult to compare well-being between people across time, and maybe, let's say, people from a certain culture might report well-being in a different way than people from another culture. So maybe measurement is also a problem.
Oh no, I agree. And as you're aware, there is a big literature on this, criticising it, and I've just been part of it. I wasn't, but there's a very wide criticism. And again, there are these points. If we want to take account of wider factors in the GDP measures, what do we take account of? Inequality? How do we handle depletion of resources? So there are many judgments which would have to be made, which would essentially be individual judgments. It wouldn't necessarily be scientifically based. But having said that, there is a certain amount of arbitrariness in the GDP, in the national accounts. How do we value the armed forces? So people have worked out conventions. But you're right. In a sense, it's about output in a market economy. So we can value the value added at market prices. So there is a scientific criteria. So I think GDP, I think it should be defended. It is, and it's not a bad measure of welfare. Where the rest are more judgmental, it's not clear what's correct. I don't have the same problem with self-reporting that many economists have. I think you're falling into the trap of revealed preference there. That people's self-reported views may be just as valid. But you're right. There are many criticisms which can be made of well-being. It's not just the fact it's a random series. In fact, if you look at the one for the UK, US, whichever, there's hardly any changes. You know, it's always, on a scale of 10, it's always 7, you know, or on a scale of 3, it's always, you know, 2.2. So it doesn't vary very much. And then people try and use time series econometrics, try and explain it, and say if we did this, people would be happier. Well, there are all these problems of, you know, which would be familiar to economists, people would learn about it, etc. So, you know, I think it's a bit of a diversion, and we've got to get let's tackle problems which we can solve, which are real problems, you know, like, you know, cycles, you know, like how do we avoid major recessions, like how do we deal with obesity, how do we deal with health issues. Let's focus on these and build on economics, you know, build on its insights and incentives, and combine this with models of choice and behaviour which are much more suited to 21st century conditions, which take account of networks. And let's do that, and let's do it in a scientific way rather than the more sometimes rather, you know, fluffy way in which the well-being enthusiasts approach the issue.